We now live in a world where an old tweet can cost you your TV show, movie franchise, or A-list journalism gig. A world where senators demand social media platforms police their content. A world where the courts have time and time again upheld broad protection of our First Amendment rights. Free expression has never been more abundant, more complicated, or more embattled. To get a handle on how to make sense of all of this, Reason turned to one of the legal profession's sharpest First Amendment practitioners. Ken White is the proprietor of the great legal blog Popehat, and he's also the host of the Make No Law podcast. A former and repentant federal prosecutor, White's day job is being a criminal defense attorney at the Los Angeles law firm of Brown, White, and Osborne. In a wide-ranging discussion, I talk with White about the dismissal of director James Gunn from the Guardians of the Galaxy film series, what limits should be put on employee speech inside and outside the workplace, and how he came to his nuanced libertarian views about law and society. We kick off the conversation by getting his views on Brett Kavanaugh, Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court. Let's talk about Brett Kavanaugh. He has been getting mostly kind of tongue baths from the right of center. He was on the Federalist list, the big list that was put together by the Federalist Society and the Heritage Society and combined by one of Trump's advisors. Brett Kavanaugh, is he good or bad for the libertarians?
I don't think he's consistent on that point. So speaking as a criminal defense attorney, I don't like how he deals with criminal defense issues, search and seizure, the Fifth Amendment, or the Sixth Amendment, those types of things. He seems to be a fairly typical mainstream conservative on those, someone in the mode of a Rehnquist or an Alito or someone in that.
And by that you mean he is, he's going to, when the coin toss comes, like, should we proceed or not, he's always going to flip it to law enforcement.
Right. He's going to give law enforcement the benefit of the doubt. He's going to continue to engage in Justice Scalia's fantasy that there's this new professionalism amongst police and therefore we can give them more deference. He's going to continue the general trend of cutting back and narrowing the criminal defendant's rights established during the Warren Court a long time ago now.
So you clearly grew up watching Dirty Harry movies, and whenever, the weak-chinned liberal lawyer would get his guy off because Dirty Harry hadn't fully secured the crime scene. Right. You were like, I want to be that guy. But everybody else in America, and certainly Brett Kavanaugh, is like, no, Dirty Harry is right.
Yeah, everyone else wants to be Clint Eastwood saying, oh, I'm all broken up about his rights.
You want to be the effete three-piece suit-wearing, feather-banged, long mustache guy being like, okay, now you go out and commit some more crimes.
It's a living. It's because everyone turns into that guy once it's their person who's getting arrested or charged, and you don't see that
you hear a lot of people talking about how badly Scooter Libby was treated by the American justice system, which thankfully pardoned him.
Well, exactly. You see him, you see all the talk about how terribly the criminal justice system is treating various people in the Trump orbit.
Oh, Joe Arpaio. Yeah, what a raw deal.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So everyone loves the rights once someone they like or respect is getting charged.
But to go to this question a little bit off kilter because it's more about criminology, but Scalia, when he was talking about things like the new professionalism, which even cropped up in arguments he was making about how you got to trust police dogs. Right. Police dogs who there is no scientifically validated evidence that police dogs are good at anything other than shitting on people's lawns.
Oh, come on, but Nick, these are not just any bitch off the street. This is the new professional dogs.
But he was saying what if God damn it, if the cop running that guy, that dog says he's a goddamn good cop, then the dog knows what he's doing, type of thing. But it is true over the past 25 years we've seen massive decreases in crime. In a lot of ways, and I even talked to people like our former colleague Radley Balco, who will grant that we witness more police brutality and overreach, but that's mostly a function of having technology that captures it. It's probably true that cops are less bad than they used to be, or that's my contention. Is that true?
I don't know whether it's true or not, but I'm skeptical about applying that as a reason to narrow our Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights and other rights. Yeah. So the way Scalia used that particular idea was to reduce the remedies we have when officers do violate our rights. So it's no longer a question of should we trust that nothing bad happens. It's a question of when something bad happens, when the officer breaks the law, what should the remedy be? And the connection there between cops are not as bad now, so there shouldn't be a remedy is not clear to me. Now, the interesting thing about Scalia was that he was decent on the Fourth Amendment when it came to, does it apply to this new technology? Does it apply to this new situation? Are you just going to get around it? Where he was bad was on remedies, on what do you do now that we've established that this is a Fourth Amendment issue.
He was actually good on saying, like, well, the founders didn't envision cell phone towers or heat thermo, things you could look through to see whether or not pot plants were being grown with, heavy uses of electricity. He'd be like, no, that's a search and you need a warrant for it. But then once the cops go in there and start beating the shit out of people, he's like, hey, what do you expect?
Well, yeah, once he's going to say they need a warrant until they come up with some warrant exception. And we thought we heard someone yelling help, and then he's going to give it to them.
Right.
So I think that...
Does Kavanaugh, in following things like that, is he indebted to Scalia's jurisprudence, or is he coming at that from his own original point of view?
Well, bear in mind there's a limited amount of Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment case law from Kavanaugh. He's in the D.C. Circuit, which is less likely than some other circuits to have that sort of thing.
So that's a lot of politicians. He's just trying to figure out, are these people human? Should they be tried in a human court or at a zoo somewhere?
And the FCC and the Federal Elections Commission and all those types of things. That's why there's a lot of First Amendment stuff on him, which I'm sure we'll get to. But in terms of the Fourth Amendment stuff, there's less. He seems to be a more typical sort of Rehnquist, Alito, that type of style of conservative, not quite so robust in protection of the Fourth Amendment as Scalia was. But it's a little early to tell. I would just say the consensus is, and I think it's fair, is that he should not be regarded as someone who reliably will hold the line on Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights.
What about free speech or the speech issues that have come up and First Amendment issues with him? Where is he coming down on that in your mind?
I think he does a pretty good job. I did a fairly deep dive on it and read through, because this is my life, all of the cases where he wrote an opinion or even joined one about the First Amendment. And what I saw is a few things. First of all, he would be very supportive of what people are sort of trash talking as weaponizing the First Amendment. And what they mean by that is applying the First Amendment to regulatory and economic type laws that it always hasn't been robustly applied to. So probably the example that makes people the maddest is net neutrality. And he's said several times in FCC cases that, look, a network's decision about what to air is part of their First Amendment rights. And you can't order them to air things or not air things, to carry stuff on cable or not, unless you can meet the standards that the First Amendment applies. So he's saying, you need to show they have some sort of disruptive market power in that market. And people are very angry at that.
Can you put like some flesh on that
Sure.
example? So what would that mean in a particular case?
Well, it might mean forcing cable companies to carry programs produced by competitors. So a lot of people say that's like net neutrality. It's, the cable should be open to everyone should carry all the programs. And someone like Kavanaugh says, well, I understand the policy reasons you want that. But in terms of First Amendment rights, the company, however much you hate them, Charter Cable or any of these, they should be able to decide what shows they want to put on. And if they don't want competitor shows, they shouldn't have to run them unless you can meet the very high standards that the First Amendment imposes.
And what would that be like? Because there are things, in cable operations or in cable law, there are must-carry laws. So
Exactly.
the cable system has to carry, and this, it took me years to figure out that I wasn't misunderstanding it, but that any cable operator must carry all of the stations that are available to its customers over the air.
Right.
Which makes no sense at all, because it's like, I could just buy an antenna and watch these things, but then they're going to clog up or limit your choices on cable because you got to put in the 3 ABC affiliates and the NBC people and all of that.
Sure. And the policy reasons for those is that there's not enough competition in the cable market, and people won't have access to these things as easily unless we force the cable companies to carry them. The First Amendment response to that is that's fine as a policy, but you don't get to force companies to do that unless you can meet basically strict scrutiny. And what Kavanaugh's been saying is not that you should never be able to force that, but that the FCC should have to make a market dominance show that these cable companies have basically manipulated or dominated a local market. So there is a reason that people can't get those channels from another source. So, and the FCC doesn't want to do that. The FCC and its supporters basically would like to have the must-carry laws apply without any sort of necessity of showing that some sort of market defect requires it.
And especially once, I mean, it's been repealed, but under a kind of open internet order where it moves, treating the internet as a public utility, then it becomes, it's almost like a food court in the Senate where, no, you've got to have McDonald's and Burger King, and then you've got to have, Skyline Chili because the guy from Ohio wants that, and, whatever small local franchise, that everything has to be fit because, that's, we're representing everybody.
Right, and so questioning net neutrality, the idea that carriers should have to carry everything at the same speed, I think is one of the biggest modern heresies to anyone who talks or operates on the internet. It's the untouchable subject. But I mean, to people like Kavanaugh, it's simply, why do we pretend that the First Amendment doesn't apply here when it does? Why should the government be able to tell cable operators what to carry and how to carry it without meeting the same tests that we would have to do if we were telling them, you can't show that political show. So he's, in that sense, very robustly in favor of aggressive application of the First Amendment. He also seems to be strong on the issues that we First Amendment gurus care about the most, about a very careful application of defamation law to protect opinion. He's clearly concerned about how frivolous litigation chills speech. He has struck down laws that limit demonstrations in national parks and things like that.
Is that, so he struck down the laws that limited the ability of people to demonstrate, or he limited the demonstrations?
Sorry, he struck down a law that required pre-registration for demonstrations in certain national spaces, saying it put too much of a burden on speech.
And that is, I guess that's part of the First Amendment that seems to get less attention, but the idea of free assembly, right?
Absolutely. Free assembly, freedom of petition, he's looked at those things.
And he comes out looking pretty good, again, from a robust kind of civil libertarian perspective.
Sure. There are a few places where traditional conservative judicial philosophy intersects with the First Amendment in a way that winds up, practically speaking, limiting rights. So, for instance, he fairly strongly, as do most conservative judges, limits the right to sue the government for things under, for instance, Section 1983, which allows you to sue state actors for acting under the color of state law, violating your rights. So he, like many conservative judges, places fairly high barriers to bringing those suits. And when the issue is a First Amendment right, that has the effect of limiting First Amendment rights. But it doesn't appear he's going after it from a, we should limit First Amendment rights perspective. It's more from a more run-of-the-mill conservative, we should limit these statutory rights to sue the government.
In a broad sense, does he have or has he articulated a judicial philosophy that, is he an originalist? Is he a textualist? Is he this? Is he that?
I'm not sure that I see that clearly coming through, but I'm not as much of an expert in those areas. What I do see about him is this, having gone through and pulled all his First Amendment decisions. He likes to write his own opinions. He likes to concur in the result, but explain his own rationale for getting there. He tends to like simpler, cleaner paths to get to things, and that sometimes winds up resembling textualism or originalism. But I think he's going to be somebody who's going to, on the Supreme Court, write a lot of dissents and a lot of concurring opinions, sort of telling the majority you're doing it the wrong way. Even if I agree with the outcome, you're getting there through this stupid way.
So he is really going to be sitting by himself at the Supreme Court lunch table, I take it, because he's going to be showing how much smarter he is than all of them?
You know, I think the people there have built up a pretty high tolerance for that sort of thing. That was certainly something that Scalia did, and yet Scalia had very close friends on both sides of the political aisle on the court.
Do you worry about the balance that the way he shifts the balance or redistributes it on the Supreme Court? Because, you know, he's one of 9, so, you know, it's one thing to be who he is in isolation, but then is this going to lead to a major shift in the way the Supreme Court starts talking about stuff?
It's certainly going to lead to a shift. But I think you have to put it in context. Part of the context is a general conservative shift over the last 40 years.
Right. And has this gone back to Rehnquist or even before Rehnquist?
Yeah, exactly.
Berger,
it's basically the reaction to the Warren Court.
Right.
So everything from Nixon thereafter. There's also been, and the older I get, the slightly less alarmed I get, because I see the recurring patterns of people saying this conservative president is going to change the court forever.
Right.
And there are changes, but it's rarely as stark and extreme as people predict. So a lot of the things I'm hearing now about Kavanaugh, I heard when George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, was appointing people to the court at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. So I think there will be changes. I think there will be a rightward drift. I don't think it will be as stark as people think. And I think as a First Amendment junkie, I'm happy that in general, the rightward drift of the court has not resulted in a narrowing of First Amendment rights for the most part.
Do you think that is that because the right, conservatives and sometimes libertarians, it's because the right believes fully in the First Amendment, whereas we know, the left, they're all agents of Russia. Oddly, even though the president, I guess, is an agent of Russia, it gets very confusing very quickly. But the First Amendment is being protected better now because it's conservatives, and conservatives have a unique love for the First Amendment, or is that kind of horseshit that right-wingers are trying to push?
I think it's primarily horseshit. I think that politically speaking, conservatives and liberals alike primarily like protecting speech they agree with. And that's sort of a very fundamental human thing. People are more likely to find excuses to protect speech they like, and more likely to think of excuses to suppress speech they don't like. And I don't see either conservatives or liberals as having a monopoly on that attitude. I think that the court, in terms of judicial philosophy, there has been a broader, more robust protection of the First Amendment, but that hasn't wound up being particularly politically liberal or conservative. I mean, if you look at some of the biggest cases of this millennium, some of them are just not really conservative in the way they protect the First Amendment. So you look at Snyder versus Phelps, the Westboro Baptist Church protesting a Marine's funeral and saying all these terrible things. I don't really see that as a conservative value, politically conservative for that to be protected.
But it did protect the right of Westboro Baptist Church to show up and annoy people at a funeral.
Exactly. You look at the flag burning cases, a little older, strictly protect speech, but in a way that the conservatives have used as a political wedge for a long time.
Is there, by the way, do you know anybody who could develop a drug we could put in the water supply so we're never talking about burning flags again? Like, why is this even an issue?
I would have taken it if I had it. I think it's because it's a wedge issue.
Right.
It's a perfect way to say, we love the flag, look ourselves, wrap ourselves in it. Those guys hate the flag.
See, this is where if I went to a anti-flag burning rally or maybe a pro-flag burning rally, I'd be really worried about wrapping myself in a flag.
Oh, exactly. It's just a bad idea. You want it to be a fireproof flag.
Yeah, that's right, an asbestos flag or something.
So what I'm saying is that a lot of the cases have not been really liberal conservative. There's been a run of cases that really agitate liberals and please conservatives.
Yeah, Citizens United probably being the biggest one. In your mind, was that settled properly? And then more to the point, is there a way where we would ever be able to get to a kind of disinterested articulation of why political speech, of all speech, should be essentially unregulated?
So those are two complicated questions. I do think that in terms of the laws at issue in Citizens United, if they were about anything else, it would be a 9-0 decision, because the type of limitation on pure political speech there is just so clearly in First Amendment heritage, not permitted in other contexts. But people have this very strong policy feeling, and I don't think it's an unreasonable policy feeling, that money is corrupting the politics. And I happen to agree with that, but I think that a lot of things are corrupting, and the First Amendment places limitations on how we deal with it. You have that. You have this term, a bunch of them. You have the Janus case, where they expanded the recognition of the First Amendment right, recognition of public unions, so that you have this free rider issue where public people can, take advantage of the unions but not have to pay for them.
And this in the case, Mark Janus, who was a state employee in Illinois, objected to having, I think it was $50 taken out of his paycheck to pay for what the union that represented him said was pure collective bargaining. It had nothing to do with, setting up playgrounds for kids or politicking for lobbying and stuff like that. And he said, hey, I don't want to pay this. And the Supreme Court agreed with him, saying that they couldn't force him to.
Right, and that was 5-4. And again, I think if it had been about anything else other than public unions, it would have been 7-2 or 8-1 or something like that.
And of course, that case, a very similar case a couple of years before, dealing with the California teacher, deadlocked at 4-4 because Scalia had just shuffled off his mortal coil.
Exactly, and this is just the ultimate, a similar one, I think, in terms of the way politics distorts the way we look at it, is a case involving compelled speech in California, where California required crisis pregnancy centers to put out all sorts of disclaimers. Hey, this isn't a real clinic. You can go get an abortion over there, and we're not licensed.
And it wasn't a real clinic because they did not perform abortions.
Right.
So they could say they're a birth control clinic, but basically wrapped in the definition of that was the idea, no, you got to be able to perform an abortion.
Right, and once again, I think it was a lot closer, that decision, than it would have been if it had been about anything about abortion. So I think things like unions, abortion, and money in politics tend to generate more purely kind of openly result-oriented jurisprudence and make people expect it more. And that's from both sides. I mean, I think if you look at the opinion in the compelled speech California case, the lengths that Justice Thomas went through to try to defend an old case that did the opposite, that said that the federal government could tell doctors that they had to kind of try to persuade women away from abortion. The hoops he had to jump through to make that sound okay under this new precedent made it seem very result-oriented. You could hardly blame people for thinking the fix is in. So tough legal areas tend to distort First Amendment analysis.
Do you feel we're also going through a kind of spasm of places where purely ideological or strongly political actors are kind of trying to get people fired? We're talking not long after James Gunn, the director of the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise, which has made billions of dollars worldwide for Disney.
Right.
A couple of right-wingers dug up old tweets that he had made. He worked for a company called Troma, which traffics in really kind of, depending on your perspective, brutally funny, nasty, mean, perverse horror movies. I mean, it's a kind of meta horror movie genre that would make, the Saw or Hostel franchises look, like they should be on Nickelodeon or something. So they dug up these old tweets where he's making, jokes about raping children and whatnot. And it's clear they're jokes. I mean, you can say they're bad taste or they're good taste, they're funny or they're not funny, but it's not, it's not like Dennis Hastert's Private Diary or anything. These are jokes. And he gets canned. This is politicizing. I guess it's not free speech, but how do you deal with that from your kind of defense attorney perspective, your interest in very robust free speech? And then we see stuff like this going on all of the time. The left-wingers did it to Brendan Eich, the head who had been named a few years ago, the head of Mozilla Firefox, a nonprofit that continues to build a browser that a lot of people like. He got canned after somebody dug up evidence that he had supported Proposition 8, an anti-gay marriage initiative here in California.
Sure.
How do you deal with these from a kind of philosophical position? Is it getting worse? And is this what free speech is all about?
So I deal with it a few ways. First of all, I think it's always important, even though people get mad and say, you don't need to tell me that, that's obvious, to point out when it's a First Amendment issue as opposed to a cultural free speech issue, okay? Because it's very important to both that we encourage education about what the First Amendment is or isn't, promote knowledge of the extent of our free speech rights as opposed to what you might call our free speech values. So I think it's important to say, yes, a company has a right to fire someone, a private company, for a speech they don't like. And I think it's important when someone in a public job gets in trouble for their speech, that we carefully go through the well-established First Amendment analysis of whether or not they can be fired for that.
And do public employees in general have broader free speech rights at the workplace?
They do. So people who are public employees are kind of a special case because their employer wears both the government hat and the employer hat. And the way the analysis winds up coming out is that their rights are not as robust as if they were a citizen on the street and the government was trying to punish them for their speech. But they're not as illusory as the private employee. So the government basically can't punish them for speech that's on an issue of public interest unless it can demonstrate that the balance of the need for a workplace that's effective and a government that operates outweighs their free speech rights. So I do First Amendment cases on the behalf of public employees who get retaliated against for legitimate political speech.
There's a guy who I believe is a public school teacher who then wrestles in a kind of amateur, professional wrestling amateur league in Pennsylvania, who is like Baron von Blitzkrieg or something, and he wears Nazi paraphernalia and this type of stuff. And he, I believe, got bounced or is about to get bounced because the school is like, that doesn't seem to fit well with the idea of educating little children about, I don't know, like compulsory gym classes or something.
Right.
I mean, it gets very confusing very quickly because, the one thing about the Nazis is they really believed in public education.
And wrestling.
But yeah, that's true. But what, where would something like that come down in this type of thing? Can the school say, what, this is going to cause so much disruption, even though you have the right to do it, get the fuck out? Or do they have to methodically show this is disruptive, and that means 3 kids a day whose parents are related to soldiers or Holocaust survivors, who died in World War II, or had issues with the Nazis, so get the fuck out, or just lump it and live with it?
So it's a tough policy question, but there is a very specific, well-established First Amendment legal route that you have to take. And this is what I think people should know about and apply. So the first step is to ask, is this part of his job? Right. Presumably his job as a middle school teacher is not wrestling in Nazi garb. If it were, then they would be more able to fire him. They can fire you based on how you do your job, okay? Yeah. So if it's not part of his job, the next question is an issue of public interest that he's speaking or acting on? And so if this is his way of self-expression out there, the answer is probably yes. If, for instance, he went out and badmouthed the principal for having bad breath or something, probably that's not an issue of public interest.
I'm guessing if your persona is like Baron von Blitzkrieg and you're going to critique your principal, it's probably not about his bad breath. I'm thinking there's probably going to be some kind of genetic or cultural component, religious maybe.
I agree, but if he were criticizing some petty workplace issue, that would not be protected because it's not on an issue of public interest.
Right.
So then once you get past that, this isn't someone who's getting fired for how they did their job, or for talking about purely internal matters, then you get to the hard part, and that's the balancing between the government's interest in a stable workplace where everyone can get along and where the government can achieve its mission, and the person's First Amendment interests. And the more core the person's speech is to political speech on issues of public concern, the more protected it's likely to be. And the more disruptive their speech is, the more unprotected it's likely to be. So,
because it could be that he's going out on the weekends and he dresses up as Benjamin Franklin and supports Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump and says like, oh, I'm Benjamin Franklin and I would love Bernie Sanders or something like that.
Exactly. So when we're talking about Nazi stuff, the way this has tended to play out is that people who are in jobs where there's a need for an appearance of neutrality, of even-handedness, of equal protection of their customers, of the people the government's interacting with, then the government's given fairly wide authority to fire people for engaging in racist outside behavior. The classic example is cops. If the cop is a Klansman on the weekend, then the courts tend to accept, well, the problem with a Klansman cop is not only you're worried he's going to, shoot non-white people, even more so than they already do, but that anytime we get sued for a shooting, we're completely screwed because the cop's a Klansman. In a school, I suspect,
I can imagine the police psychologist being like, you know what, you've got to set boundaries. You need some time to yourself. If you're just going from being a cop to being a Klansman, take a break.
When is it about you? So in a school, I suspect the court's analysis is going to be similar. So the guy might say, look, the Nazism is ironic. It's mostly a dress-up fetish and not a political thing.
Not all, but mostly.
Well,
90%.
So he's going to say, wrestling is traditionally about, pretending to be these outsized characters that don't really reflect you. But I think he's going to have trouble because people are going to say that education is about all the kids, no matter their ethnic background, being treated equally.
Whereas at a private school, they might be like, yeah, he's doing it, and sure, why
Boom,
not?
you're gone.
Or like either he's doing it and we don't give a shit, or you're gone, and that's the end of the issue.
So if you're a private employee, then absent your contract protecting you, or absent some state or local law protecting you, the First Amendment isn't protecting you. Okay? So there are some laws, some states that limit the ability to fire people for their politics. And obviously you can't fire someone for their politics when that's just a ruse for firing them for their gender or their race or something like that. But generally...
But there were times where if you were a member of the Communist Party or other parties, you could get fired.
That was one of the big free speech fights of the 50s and 60s. But it sort of developed on a different track than this. The law on speaking out as a government employee developed on fairly mundane things. Pickering, the key old case, is a teacher sending a letter to the editor about how the district spends money and manages things badly. Another key case, Connick, is about a deputy DA employee talking about office management. So these are not big, I'm a communist type things.
Does that tie into Harry Connick?
It is Harry Connick's father, I believe, who was the DA, who was the employer in the case. So
Harry Connick, we got to get rid of this guy.
He's nothing but
I don't know how many anchor babies he's had, but even one's too many.
He's constitutionally suspect, Nick.
What about? Let's talk about the case to moment. And by the time this interview is over, much less actually shows up online, hopefully, the aliens will have invaded. And Baron von Blitzkrieg will have won the big belt. James Gunn getting canned over this. What is your sense? And again, I mean, there's the legal questions, and then there's kind of the cultural questions. And you talk about a distinction between First Amendment law and then First Amendment kind of values.
Culture.
How do those fit together? And do the laws tend to be enforced in a more brittle, harsh way when we have a more brittle or narrow First Amendment culture, a free speech culture? Or are these things totally separate from one another?
Well, I think people are more willing to support robust application of the First Amendment legally when there's a more robust free speech culture. But they do operate separately. And the trick with First Amendment culture is I think that people lose track of the idea that everyone in the picture has First Amendment rights. Everyone has free speech rights. So yeah, you look at the firing of Mr. Gunn. Done, I think, entirely cynically by the people who accused him.
Right.
Purely to own the libs, as they say.
Sure.
It's a pure culture war move, not out of any genuine concern that he was actually a pedophile, at least not any non-crazy concern.
Right.
What you have to understand is that Disney, as the employer, has First Amendment rights too. Disney has free association rights. And I'm not saying that makes it right for them to fire him. What I'm saying is...
Or wise.
Or wise.
But they do have the right to fire.
They have the right. And what I'm saying is that we should bring the free speech culture ideas even-handedly. So we shouldn't impose on anyone any sort of obligation that we're not imposing on everybody. So
why not?
I think that the reason that...
But why? Why shouldn't I just want to get rid of people I think are douchebags.
Well, sure. And then we should judge you for being a judgmental douchebag about that. What
I can take it.
What I'm saying is we shouldn't lionize a person who tells douchey jokes on Twitter and say that's sacrosanct and you shouldn't criticize it. On the other hand, be very critical of someone's First Amendment free association choices as their employer.
Right.
Okay, I think you have to be critical of everybody in the picture. So the way it often
and this is independent of the law stuff. We can talk a little bit, but how do you get to that? Like what creates a flourishing free speech? A kind of Voltairean paradise of. And I realize he didn't say it. It's probably the same guy who wrote Chief Seattle's speech or something in 1970. But the idea that I'll defend your right to say whatever you want, and you defend mine, and we're better off that way, even if we agree on nothing. How do you get to that place?
Well, I think you have to be very cognizant of what it means to defend the right. First of all, it means absolutely you have to legally, rigorously defend the right and say that I hate this speech, but this is how the First Amendment applies, and this is their rights. I think the conflict we're getting into politically in terms of free speech culture is the not even-handed way it gets applied. So when someone outrageous and provocative whose whole shtick is offending and owning the libs comes to campus, then I think they should be allowed to. I think their right to should be protected. I think that the right of the students to invite them should be legally protected. I think that should be protected from physical violence. But there's also this sentiment that it should be protected from really aggressive criticism or protest. And I don't see why we should lionize someone who comes on campus to be a dick and not equally lionize people who are a dick in response. That doesn't make sense to me. And I think this dichotomy where because you're the guy on stage...
You're married, right?
I
to
am.
a woman, but you spend a lot of time thinking about dicks, don't you?
Well, it's a consequence of being a criminal defense attorney and a First Amendment lawyer. It's kind of an occupational hazard.
But, it's interesting with the campus stuff. It's like, so you think of somebody like Milo, the best thing, the thing that extended his 15 minutes was he kept getting shut down. Because once he was allowed to actually talk, people were like, God, this guy's just an asshole. Like, he has nothing to say that is of interest to anyone, and he kind of starts to go away.
Exactly. I think the reaction to him is often everything he wants it to be. It's empowering.
The most important thing is like, this guy's like, God, I don't have a speech tonight. It's a good thing I won't have to give it.
So the free speech values is a pitch to people about ethics and morality and about what kind of society we want. And I think it's a very unappealing pitch when what we're saying is not only do you have to allow this person to speak, but you can't call him an asshole.
Right.
Okay? That to me is completely unappealing. And I think that is the way that some of the dialogue is drifting and some of the reason that you get so much hostility to talk about free speech values.
Does this happen on the left, or what is the basic dynamic on the left that kind of corresponds with this?
Well, on the left, I guess it would be that the idea that you shouldn't be tone policing, the idea that not only should we listen to people talking about these progressive values, but we shouldn't criticize the way they utter them. To me, that's nonsense. I say we protect the right to speak out freely. We do that vigorously and aggressively. We make full use of the courts. But you're going to call an asshole, and that's the way it goes. And my right to say that person's acting like a jerk is no more or less important than the person's right to be a jerk. So I think when we're trying to sell this package that free speech values means we're going to sit here quietly while you're a jerk on campus is not sensible and not appealing. The other thing I see going on here that I think is a real problem is I think that people are participating in classifying free speech as a conservative issue, okay? So part of this is coming out of these sort of classically conservative Supreme Court cases, that go against a union or go against abortion or something like that. It makes it easy to classify the First Amendment as being conservative if it has conservative political outcomes.
Right.
But the other thing that's happening...
And historically that's wrong because
absolutely.
In the 50s and 60s, conservatives weren't happy. Howell, could be published without somebody being thrown in jail, or
absolutely.
the Pentagon Papers could be published.
Saying that the First Amendment is conservative is historically completely illiterate. Right. It's about protecting mostly progressives from being suppressed over most of the 20th century. Right. But the other thing that's happening, I think, is that we're buying into this narrative where, the liberals on campus want to suppress speech and the conservatives want speech, and therefore let's make fun of the liberals and let's lionize the conservatives. You see a lot of sites, that instead of just talking about the First Amendment, are really culture warrior sites where the free speech fights are between liberalism and conservatism. And first of all, it's not accurate. Free speech is in just as much danger from conservatives. You only have to look at things like the Attorney General of the United States pretending to be against campus censorship when he made an effort to shut down speech about gays and lesbians on campus. You only have to look at...
What are the particulars of that?
Oh, he tried to use the force of law to shut down gay and lesbian organizations from presenting on campus when he was a state attorney general, okay? So you look at the increased popularity in laws punishing students for protest on campus. Now that's being spun as protecting people's right to speech without interference, but it's a very vague, ambiguous tool that can be used to punish all types of speech. You look at these laws across the country about how you can run over a protester if they scare you. All this stuff are examples of how conservative values can also drive censorship. Right. So when we buy into this narrative that free speech is a conservative value and censorship is a liberal value, we basically invite this chasm where the First Amendment and free speech values steadily gets less and less support. Because, the pendulum will swing again. Yeah. Everyone thinks that, this is the worst ever and this is the way it's going to be forever. But, you only have to look back to Obama getting elected, and all of a sudden, and we're in a democratic blue country forever. And then look a few years before that, and the Republicans have a permanent majority. It swings back and forth. And so if you participate in classifying free speech as a conservative value, you are screwed when the pendulum swings back to liberalism again. And it may start to have very dramatic impact long-term on the judiciary, on politicians, on everybody who's going to accept this frame and start using that idea as an excuse to restrict speech more and sell it to people. You know that it's okay to have this type of censorship because those guys are talking about the First Amendment, but that's just a conservative trope. So I think that even conservatives should be very reluctant to accept that.
What about, one of the things in the past few months we've had the Facebook hearings where Mark Zuckerberg talked before various parts of Congress. Probably the single biggest takeaway was that many people in Congress had never heard of Facebook or did not even know that there were computers. I think they think centipede games in like old restaurants, that's the internet or something.
It's a series of tubes.
Yeah, But does Facebook or how much does it worry you when you see a place like Facebook? Twitter has done this to a certain degree. YouTube has done this to a certain degree. Google. where they recognize and they kind of openly say, as Facebook, as Zuckerberg did, yeah, it's time, we're going to be regulated, it's time for regulation, and I want to help you write those regulations. And at one point he even said, I want to help you write those regulations, and I should because I know this business better than you guys do, and you know that these regulations are going to make it harder for the next Facebook or the next public media, social media platform to come out. Again, this isn't strictly legal. Facebook is a private entity. They can do whatever the hell they want, that blah, blah, blah. But is this worrying kind of in terms, not in terms of the legality of First Amendment stuff, or possibly even the culture, but this is kind of like the infrastructure, the technology of free expression is starting to move into a different space. Are you worried about that? And how do we make sure, I guess to wrap it up, the question is, look, how do I make sure that Diamond and Silk get fully, get the audience they deserve? Because this is that ridiculous, terrible duo that is pro-Trump,
right,
that is constantly saying, and Ted Cruz would be like, Diamond and Silk aren't as big as they should be because Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and, everyone in the world, is keeping them down through their algorithms. To put a pin on it, it's, the conservatives are constantly talking about how like all forms of social media have now conspired. I mean, it's like a line grafted out of the Communist Manifesto. All the powers of the world are now aligned on social media to make sure Diamond and Silk doesn't get the full universal audience it deserves.
Well, exactly. I mean, you hear this rhetoric coming from conservatives that sounds very much like what you used to get from very liberal people. The market is broken. These private companies are making unfair decisions. We've got to regulate them. That's not conservative to me. Diamond and Silk should get the full audience they can get. They have a right to that. Right. They don't have the right to the private platform of their choice. Because again, to come back to what I said earlier, I don't think people appreciate or agree that Twitter and Facebook have rights too. Free speech and free association rights. And to go all Mitt Romney on you, corporations are people too, my friend. Corporations are just the way that groups of people.
I have to admit that some of my very best friends are corporations.
Well, I'm with
you. I don't know, when I call Uber and I need a ride, that corporation shows up half the time. My friends are like, fuck it, I'm asleep. Call
Jack Daniels, I don't know who makes Ativan, but whoever that is. My concern is it's similar to what I said earlier about having to put the same standard on everybody, okay? I think that Twitter and Facebook have free association, free speech rights to say this is the type of platform we want to have. Disneyland, they can decide to have the type of environment they want to have, a family-friendly one, okay? Twitter and Facebook can decide they want to be the sort of places where you can speak and Nazis won't get in your face.
We want Diamond, but not Silk. Silk is out. That's the deal.
So it's appalling to me when people see private companies making free expression choices and using that as an excuse, okay, let's regulate this industry because whatever the government's going to do, it's going to screw it up. It's going to do it terribly and it's not going to increase speech. So I find this sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater idea that these private applications of speech are not helping me, so I want to limit that speech to be very short-sighted. Because if people think that Facebook and Twitter are judgmental about politics, wait till the government gets involved. There's no logical or rational reason to think that they will do better.
When we talk about free speech on Twitter, and Twitter is obviously like the single greatest way to get rid of your enemies. Right, Roseanne stepped in it. I mean, she kind of threw it out there, but James Gunn and other people. What are some of your favorite Twitter insults? You are a master. You're like, the way Bob Dylan is the master of the put down song, Positively 4th Street, Idiot Wind, a variety of songs like that. You're a pretty good put down artist on Twitter. What are some of your favorite put downs?
My father is so proud, and my mother would be too. I don't know. I love the language. I love English, and I love its possibilities. So, to me, it's fun to do a combination of the obscene and the non-obscene. So, if you call someone a scruffless cock nugget, then they probably haven't heard that week. They probably heard all sorts of other things that week, but not that particular one.
I love the idea. You're like the Frederick Bastiat of Twitter, the famous French journalist who was famous for the phrase, what is seen and what is unseen, but you are what is seen and what is obscene on Twitter.
Well, I get a certain amount of static from some people, and I have to explain to them that Twitter is its own medium, and that no one thinks that someone who calls someone a demi-literate twat waffle on Twitter, that doesn't mean they're necessarily the sort of person who's going to say that in court or at a garden party. Or
have you had like open heart surgery yet, where you're like, oh yeah, Ken, don't worry, I'm the best twat waffle in this business, just as the anesthesia mask is going on your head?
I have had opposing parties, including recently a DA in court, attempt to quote me on Twitter to embarrass or contradict me. It's never gone in their favor.
But is that a legitimate tactic? Because that's essentially what is happening more and more. Where again, James Gunn, the director who's made billions of dollars for Disney,
right?
In movie theaters, he's not making money for Disney on Twitter, for God's sake. Nobody is, but. He gets somebody, rifles through his back catalog, gets a bunch of tweets. Is it legitimate to, kind of leverage what somebody's saying on Twitter or Facebook or whatever and throw it into a different setting to fuck them over?
I don't know what you mean by legitimate. It's speech. Is it dickish speech? I think very often it is.
But what I mean, I guess I don't want to use like a British term, like is it cricket? Obviously it's legal. Obviously you can do it. Is it a strategy that we should kind of enjoy and do more of, where you bring in, semi-irrelevant information from one sphere of activity in a person's life to kind of discredit them?
No, I don't like it as a tactic. I think that it usually backfires in court, from what I've observed, which is good. And the people who try to do it are generally kind of ham-fisted about it. And I think that using it, in the culture wars to get people fired is very much a double-edged sword, and no one should be feeling confident about that happening. Anyone, you live by the sword, die by the sword, and anyone's vulnerable to that sort of thing, unless you're going to be boring.
What about something, though, that is, I think everybody would agree is more serious? Let's say somebody is a horrible racist, misogynistic, homophobe, something over here, and then that gets brought to bear in their professional setting. Is that, should those rivers or those streams never cross?
That's a free speech and free association question. So the people who are bringing their conduct into the dialogue someplace else are engaging in their own speech. The people who are making free association decisions based on it are engaging in their own speech. And I think the trick is to judge all of them, not just one of them. So you don't just say...
Well, you're always pushing for that kind of, let's be serious about this, and this is an ecosystem. But I don't know that you can do this, but like you get rid of the criminal charges against Harvey Weinstein.
Right.
But then if he's still making really good movies, and this is also, we're already in a counterfactual because he had been bombing at the box office for a long time, which is not, it's not an accident that he got canned after 15 years of stinking at, making money-making movies. But is his personal life and his professional life, should those be held separately? Jim Jordan, as a politician, an Ohio congressman who was an assistant wrestling coach at Ohio State, is now being charged with knowingly looking the other way when something like 150 wrestling students say they were being molested by the team doctor, and that Jordan had to have known about it. That happened a long time ago. He wasn't a congressman. Should that affect, whether or not he gets to be the next Speaker of the House?
That's like saying, should I like poetry? It's a matter of taste.
I just want to point out, you just compared child molesting to poetry.
Not good poetry, let's be clear.
But it's still poetry. Yeah. But you know what? I mean, because this is one of the outcomes, and it's not really a legal thing, but it's like if everything everybody's been doing for the past 15 or 20 years is recorded somewhere, right? Because we've all been writing and we've all been tweeting, or we have pictures on Facebook. This is like that Robert Mitchum movie, Out of the Past, that was made into Against All Odds. Like, everybody has the James Woods character or, a Kirk Douglas showing up.
Right.
It's who's going to fuck up your present.
So, but you're asking really, how should we treat art based on what we think of the artist's personal life or the artist as a personality? And what I'm saying is that's a very personal decision. Right. I love Wagner, even though he's a terrible racist and a pre-Nazi.
I love Wagner except for the music.
No, and Ezra Pound is a big anti-Semite, and I can't
and a terrible poet.
Exactly.
He was a good editor. That's it.
Right. So to me, it's idiosyncratic. I'm not going to pretend that it's rational or methodical. Some people I no longer enjoy their art because they're total assholes in their personal life. Some people I do, and I don't know why.
And I suppose in different cases, I mean, depending on the severity of the bad behavior, if people apologize, if people make amends, if they show they have changed or it doesn't interfere here.
What drives me crazy here is how I think completely hypocritical almost everyone is about this. So almost everyone doesn't like it when it happens to some people and do like it when it happens to others. So everyone who's saying that it's terrible, this is happening, they're likely to applaud it when it's, Roman Polanski, whose movies I can't watch because I think of him being, unrepentant, fled child rapist.
There's an easy way out of that too is just don't watch his movies because 90% of them are terrible.
Well, exactly. But I think most people will go one way or the other depending on how they feel about the artist. And what we're really talking about, even in politics to some extent, my comparison isn't so much child molestation to poetry, but it's politics to art.
The Roy Moore scandal was kind of clarifying the Republican nominee for Senate from Alabama who was credibly charged with basically being a jailbait junkie. I mean, like he was cruising malls and stuff like that. Didn't have good. Even Ted Cruz eventually withdrew his support for him and things like that.
He was just concerned about education.
You got to start young.
Yeah, exactly.
But it is. Do you feel like we're just getting worse and worse because of tribal politics instead of using this as a moment to reset a conversation where we can say, look, people are human. A lot of situations are very uncomfortable, very difficult. We need to be more human and be more kind rather than to be more tribal and just celebrate this, that, or the other thing.
I'm always skeptical of the idea that things are really worse now than they have been on almost anything. So I would ask you, when would you find a time in America when some element of personality didn't wind up in politics? Whether it's someone has a history of depression or Muskie with his melting snowflakes crying or the horrible things that the founding fathers sometimes said about each other.
And the founders, I mean, we have not even tapped into how mean and wonderfully nasty they were at the time.
Absolutely. But, Hamilton is basically a musical indistinguishable from Mean Girls. It's just people trash talking each other.
What I like about it too is that in Hamilton, the guy from New Jersey wins. That's so it's does the somebody like Thomas Eagleton, who was George McGovern's first running mate, when it came out that he had shock treatment and had been treated for depression, it was like, okay, get out. Probably wouldn't happen now.
That part wouldn't, but it's an illustration of how all the time we've used all sorts of elements of personality and background. We just choose different ones now. So before it was any tinge that you had some sort of connection to communism or sympathy, or you were insufficiently hostile to communism was the deal breaker. Now it's racism. And I'm not sure that I think that's a terrible thing. I think it can be overused and used unfairly and uncharitably. But what I'm saying is, I'm skeptical of this view that now we are more than ever trading in personalities rather than politics.
I've heard you describe yourself as a civil libertarian, which is a code to me that you're really a communist or something. But how do you define your politics generally, or your ideology?
So I'm a civil libertarian, meaning that I'm in favor of very vigorous protection and application of constitutional rights to protect individuals. I would say I'm a small L libertarian. That means that I'm not going to be marching to privatize the Air Force tomorrow, but I believe in a sensibility.
But you do look forward to the day when they have to hold bake sales in order to buy bombers or something like that.
And I'll be there. Believe me, I will eat up my way to a stealth bomber right on my own. I describe small L libertarianism as a sensibility where you are skeptical about whether the government is the right tool to do something, skeptical about whether the government winds up getting you the result you want, skeptical about whether the use of government authority to achieve ends winds up really benefiting rich and powerful people, because that's the way government works. So I'm not so result-oriented. I don't freak out. I'm not one of the people saying we should blow up the UN. I'm not going to strip on stage at a convention. But
well, there goes our gala 50th anniversary. We're going to have to get a new headlining act, but thank you.
But my philosophy is always ask, why should the government be doing this? Does it really help for the government?
Where did that come from in you?
Came from concerns about free speech and the rights of defendants. It came.
You had been a federal prosecutor.
Yes.
Right? I mean, the worst of the worst, the types of people who suppress and gag the speech of media organizations like Reason, and then you get on the other side.
Well, I started to go on the other side when I was a prosecutor. I started to become disenchanted.
Were you throwing cases? You were like Al Pacino in Justice for All, where you're like, you're out of order, Judge.
No, but I started to think, is this what I want to do with my life? I still respect the people there. It's some of the best years of my career. It's a wonderful community of people. But I can't participate in the drug war, and I just think that I'm much more a true believer as a defense lawyer than I ever was as a prosecutor. And I guess my sense is that I understand the need for government. I'm not, I'm not the stereotypical libertarian that people deride as someone who wants us to be Somalia.
Right.
But I think that we always have to be very cautious. That government is the giant vicious dog you bring into your house to protect you from robbers. Well, you got to be careful around the dog and the baby and the cat and that type of thing, okay? And government traditionally winds up protecting the interests of the connected, the moneyed, and the powerful. And, if you had to point to something that kind of displays recently my libertarian sensibility and what gets me annoyed, it's the story this week about San Francisco talking about banning cafeterias in businesses like Google or Twitter or Facebook, because if you've got an internal cafeteria, then people won't go patronize the local restaurants. And it's the restaurant association that's pushing that.
Right.
So, it's nominally something that they have some thin veneer that it's the good of society, but it's really one group of people with money going after another group of people with money. So my sensibility is not so much always exactly what the outcome should be, but that we should look at things like that, the decision to use government as the tool to achieve something, with great skepticism.
In one way, you were talking about the First Amendment. We tend to take it as a given, going back to the ancient Egyptians or whoever settled this country, that we always had First Amendment rights and they were vigorously enforced. But really, when you start to go back, it's the 50s, kind of the late 50s and the 60s, a good chunk of time in the 70s. These, what we consider First Amendment rights, are so recently won. The robust First Amendment, where you can shout, maybe not fire in a crowded theater, but you can shout "fuck you," and we have technological innovation so that you can say whatever you want, wherever you want, in ways that were unforeseeable even 20 years ago. Are we doing enough to remind both people our age is generally, but also younger people, that this is kind of like a bubble? We're living in a historical bubble that could pop at any time. Does that inability to kind of look backward or look forward disturb you? And then what's the best way to address that?
So it does disturb me, because I think people don't know as much about the First Amendment as they should. Of course, I'm a lawyer. I'm going to think that people should be familiar with it. Right. Just the way a mechanic thinks you should be able to, know how your car works. Right. But I mean, the First Amendment is what lets me say that, lets you disagree with me. And it's not rocket science. I can do it. I'm not the brightest guy around. And I think people could understand the background a lot more. And I think people could get behind the stories. The First Amendment is about incredible stories of Americans standing up for themselves and fighting back against incredible odds that we can barely imagine standing up in those circumstances. So I've been doing a podcast called Make No Law that's about the history of the First Amendment, one case at a time. And I've gotten to talk to people like Mary Beth Tinker, who was a 13-year-old girl who put on a black armband to protest the Vietnam War against, all sorts of social ostracism and outrage. About a guy named Sidney Street who burned an American flag because he was outraged that James Meredith had gotten shot during a march. All these stories about the First Amendment are important not just because they show how recent these rights are and how often they've been trampled, but they show how universal some of the issues are and how broad the group is that's fought for these rights. The stories are the way I think we fight against this narrative that free speech is just a conservative value. Mary Beth Tinker wasn't a conservative. Sidney Street wasn't a conservative. A lot of these people were progressives, were outcasts, were the despised people in society.
Tinker was what, like a Jehovah's Witness or Seventh-day Adventist or something?
I think they were Methodists.
It
was a very progressive family. The parents were very anti-war, but she decided on her own, I care about
this. I was just telling some people I work with, I think last night, that they came through, it was either them or somebody in their family came to the middle school and kind of talked about it. And what was really interesting about their experience was that in the context of the Gulf War, or the wars we're fighting now, people were kind of like, "Oh, you're really part of the problem. You're the reason we lost Vietnam," or something.
Right.
And so it's a living, breathing history case in a lot of this stuff. But it's terrifying. Or from a literary point of view. And I'm mixed because I think these books are generally unreadable and best forgotten, but even books like Ulysses and Lady Chatterley's Lover could only be published legally in the U.S. in like 1960 or 61. And it's like, what kind of free speech country are we pretending to be when it takes that long to publish books that are just not even going to be read by most people?
And people, when they learn the history behind some of the censorship tropes that we use every day, tend to be appalled, they tend to be converts. So, everyone uses the fire in a crowded theater. You can't shall fire in a crowded theater and cause a panic. Well, when you tell people about this case, that it's actually about someone protesting against the draft in World War I in very patriotic, pro-rights terms, and they got jailed for it, then all of a sudden they're not so thrilled about that rhetoric anymore. Or people talk nonstop about how we should be able to stop hate speech because it's fighting words. Well, if people look at the history of that case and see, okay, this is a guy who was not uttering fighting words. He was a Jehovah's Witness preaching on a street corner, and a mob was attacking him, and the cops were basically, okay, go have your fun. And they only arrested him when he talked back to a cop. All of a sudden, that urge to use that classic exception is no longer so strong. So I think the way to win hearts and minds on this is not to classify free speech as conservative or liberal. It's not to use it as sort of a culture war weapon to own the libs.
Should we start, especially in Trump's America, maybe we should start touting it as a good Russian value?
Absolutely.
Final question. Do you think Kavanaugh will be nominated or will be confirmed? And what is the general role of the Supreme Court in changing American society? Is it a radical game changer? Is it a lagging indicator? Does it certify social trends that have already, or transformations that have taken place? Does it speed it up a little bit? So Kavanaugh, yes or no? Is he going to get in? And if you have any specific gossip that would keep him from getting in, some tweets about pedophiles or 3 men and a baby, please out them right now. But then how important is the Supreme Court?
Well, I don't see how he doesn't get in. I mean, I hear all these scenarios about how people might oppose him. And of course, you've got the Rand Pauls of the world posturing that they're still making up their mind, but I think it's pretty clear he gets in. The Supreme Court is hugely important over the last century. And I don't know whether you say that the trends drive the court or the court drives the trends, but you look at things like desegregation, abortion, gay marriage, free speech, all these rights that really the court has been the driving force on. It's hugely important. And yet perversely, it's the institution that I think we are as a society the least well informed about how it does its work, about how it gets to those ends. And that's why it's so easy to manipulate people to say that this was a purely political decision, or to say that law and order is a judicial value as opposed to a conservative political value. or that free speech is conservative as opposed to a legal doctrine. So I think what we need to make the Supreme Court a more fair, an institution that we can respect more, that is seen as less autocratic, is to have more people understand how it gets to where it gets, understand what goes on there. And again, it's not rocket science.
And I said I was going to ask you one last question, but let me throw this out there too. The Supreme Court, is more diverse ethnically, religiously, gender-wise, et cetera, than it ever has been, or basically.
As long as Harvard and Yale are religion,
well,
yes.
Yeah, this is what I was going to ask is there a problem with it becoming concentrated where I believe it is all two schools? It's just two schools, are represented there in terms of law degrees. The people increasingly, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh went to high school together.
Right.
Everybody goes to the same law school. Everybody, is that a problem? Most of them are from the same part of the country geographically. Is there a stronger case for a not just ideological diversity on the Supreme Court, but a geographical one and a educational one, a pedagogical one?
I think the bigger impact may be the sort of classic path to the court idea, the idea that you go to a big clerkship and then maybe you teach, or maybe you work as a solicitor general and eventually you're on the federal bench. It's a fairly narrow range. I like to see the diversity of legal experience because I think that people who have only been professors or judges and have never been in the proverbial trenches, whether as a prosecutor or a defense attorney or a trial attorney.
Do we need a bail bondsman on the Supreme Court?
Well,
as much as I'm against bail bonds. But,
for a year at a time with the premium to be repaid.
Yeah.
I would like to see more people, and there are a few of them, who have real experience trying cases, dealing with clients. Because one of the problems with the Supreme Court, I think, is the very sort of elite academic air that can be very removed from what legal practice is really like. And it can be a real problem when people on the court have ideas about the way things happen in the trial court. And those ideas aren't really connected to reality. So, Scalia's police professionalism thing that we talked about is kind of an example of that, but it's also, the court has to make a lot of decisions that are kind of cloaked in law, but are really about what's reasonable. What's reasonable?
Like if he's figuring, I saw an episode of T.J. Hooker, and
right.
I know they would never do that. So, this guy's guilty.
I saw the one, where the entire plot was about a guy with a laser sight on his gun, and they defeated him with a disco ball. That's why I miss the 80s. But to move away from T.J. Hooker back to the Supreme Court, I think that they're making a lot of decisions about what trial lawyers should do or should be able to do, what trial judges should do. And I think sometimes those decisions are not informed by actual experience in the trial court. So I would like to see more Supreme Court justices who have been a public defender or a DA or a trial lawyer or represented
How about a
indigent.
defendant?
Or a defendant. Well,
a defendant before before their term on the Supreme Court ends.
That seems almost inevitable in 2018. So I think that people who have been there and done the work that they're ruling on would inevitably cause a change in the makeup of the court. Right. And it wouldn't be something as, like geography. It would be about experience.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there. We've been talking with Ken White. He is a partner at Brown, White, and Osborne, a defense attorney firm in California. He's also the host of a podcast that is called Make No Law, which is about the First Amendment. And of course, he blogs at Popehat, one of the most exciting and foul language-ridden blogs in the legal world, but also anywhere else. Ken, thanks for talking.
It's been a great pleasure.
For Reason, I'm Nick Gillespie.